The guns have gone quiet, the missiles have stopped falling, and they're calling it peace, but the Middle East is still on the edge. But here is the contradiction at the heart of this moment. The ceasefire is holding, and the region is not stable. Those two things are both true at the same time, and understanding how they can coexist is the only way to understand what is actually happening across the Middle East right now. This is not a story about war ending. This is a story about what war looks like when it goes underground. To understand where we are, you have to understand how we got here. The ceasefire that is currently in place did not emerge from a moment of goodwill. It did not come from a sudden willingness to compromise or from a genuine change of heart among the parties involved. It came from exhaustion, from international pressure, from the weight of casualty figures that were becoming impossible to ignore, and from backroom negotiations conducted by mediators who spent weeks threading an almost impossibly narrow diplomatic needle. The agreement was presented to the world in the language of diplomacy. Senior officials stood at podiums and spoke about a humanitarian pause, about the protection of civilians, and about the first step toward a lasting resolution. The word sustainable was used. The word progress was used. In Washington, the announcement was met with cautious optimism. In European capitals, foreign ministers expressed relief. The United Nations called for the ceasefire to be extended and made permanent, and on the surface, the numbers supported the optimism. Airstrikes dropped, artillery fire fell silent in certain zones. Aid convoys began to move through corridors that had been blocked for months. Casualty reports slowed. Satellite imagery showed less smoke rising from residential areas. The visual evidence of active conflict began to ease. This is how a ceasefire is supposed to look. This is what escalation is supposed to feel like. And for millions of ordinary people living in the affected areas, the silence, however fragile, was not nothing. It was breathing room. It was the first night of sleep without the sound of explosions in months. The human cost of that silence should not be dismissed. But here is the problem. A ceasefire is not a peace agreement. It is not a resolution. It is not even the beginning of one, necessarily. A ceasefire is a suspension. It is two fighters stepping back from each other, both still holding their weapons, and both still watching each other's hands. The agreement pauses the violence. It does not touch the conditions that produced the violence. And in the Middle East, those conditions are not only still present, in several critical dimensions, they have actually deepened. Start with what is still happening on the ground. Because even within the formal boundaries of the ceasefire, the military reality across the region remains one of the most concentrated and volatile in the world. Israel has not stood down its military. The Israel Defense Forces remain in a state of high readiness across multiple fronts simultaneously. Along the northern border with Lebanon, troop deployments have not been significantly reduced. Intelligence operations continue. Surveillance drones continue to fly over contested territory. And critically, Israel has maintained what its officials describe as the right to act independently in defense of its national security. That is not a ceremonial statement. It is a policy declaration. It means that the ceasefire, as far as Israel is concerned, does not constrain its freedom of action when it believes a threat is imminent or active. This is not unusual for Israel. It has exercised this doctrine consistently for decades. But in the current environment, with tensions this high and with so many armed actors in such close proximity, that doctrine carries exceptional risk. Don't move further north, and the picture becomes more complex. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militant group and political party that operates with the full backing of Iran, has not disarmed. It has not withdrawn its forces from southern Lebanon. It has not dismantled the vast missile arsenal it has accumulated over years of support from Tehran. Estimates vary, but analysts believe Hezbollah possesses somewhere between 120,000 and 150,000 rockets and missiles of varying range and precision. That is more than most nations, and those weapons have not moved. Those weapons are still pointed south. Hezbollah emerged from the recent period of conflict with its military infrastructure damaged but intact. It suffered losses. It absorbed blows that were real and significant. But the organization has demonstrated, across decades of conflict, an extraordinary capacity for resilience. It rebuilds, it waits, and its political leadership has been careful, in public statements, to describe the current ceasefire not as a victory but as a temporary condition. That is a signal. It is worth reading carefully. Further south, in Yemen, the Houthi movement continues to operate with a degree of capability that the international community has found consistently difficult to degrade. The Houthis launched attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea that disrupted global trade routes and forced major shipping companies to reroute vessels thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope. Those attacks did not stop because of diplomatic pressure or military deterrence alone. They paused, modulated, and shifted in response to military strikes. But the Houthis retained and rebuilt their drone and missile inventory even under sustained bombardment. The group's ability to project force into one of the world's most critical maritime corridors has not been eliminated. It has been demonstrated, and it remains. In Iraq and Syria, Iranian-backed militia networks continue to operate. These are not small groups. They are organized, armed, trained, and coordinated. They include factions like Kataib Harakat al-Nujaba and the Popular Mobilization Forces, an umbrella organization with tens of thousands of fighters that is formally integrated into the Iraqi state security apparatus while simultaneously taking direction from Tehran. These groups conducted attacks on American military positions in Iraq and Syria in the recent escalation cycle. Some of those attacks killed and wounded American service members. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas did not include these groups. They are not party to it. They are not bound by it. And they continue to operate in a strategic space that is, at best, only loosely governed. This is what the region actually looks like beneath the silence of the ceasefire. It looks like tens of thousands of armed fighters, answerable to various states and non-state actors, spread across multiple countries, many of them ideologically committed to objectives that are fundamentally incompatible with any stable regional order. The ceasefire silenced one front. It did not silence the network to understand why this network exists and why it is so difficult to dismantle. You have to go back to the architecture of the conflict itself, because this is not, at its core, a dispute over territory, or over political power, or even over ideology alone. It is all of those things. But underneath all of them is a structural competition for regional dominance between two powers, Iran and Israel, with the United States as both a guarantor of the existing order and, increasingly, a power that is reassessing the terms of its own commitment. Iran's strategic project in the Middle East is built on a doctrine that its military and intelligence establishment calls the axis of resistance. The idea is straightforward, though its execution is extraordinarily complex. Rather than confronting its adversaries directly, Iran projects power through a network of proxy forces distributed across the region: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, various militias in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. Each of these groups has its own history, its own grievances, its own local political base. They are not purely Iranian puppets, but they share a common adversary framework, and they are supported, armed, trained, and in varying degrees directed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, specifically its Quds Force, which specializes in exactly this kind of external projection. This network gives Iran something that conventional military power cannot provide. It gives Iran plausible deniability. When a Hezbollah missile hits a target in northern Israel, Iran did not fire that missile. When a Houthi drone strikes a ship in the Red Sea, Iran did not launch that drone. The physical distance between Tehran and the point of impact is real, even if the strategic connection is not. And that distance matters enormously, because it makes the question of how to respond to Iranian-backed attacks genuinely complicated. Retaliate against the proxy, and you may degrade the capability temporarily without altering the strategic calculus. Retaliate against Iran itself, and you risk a conflict of a completely different magnitude. And then there is the nuclear dimension. This is the issue that sits underneath every other issue in the region. Like tectonic pressure under a fault line, Iran's nuclear program has continued to advance. Analysts and international inspectors have documented that Iran has enriched uranium to levels that are inconsistent with any civilian energy program. The technical gap between where Iran currently stands and the ability to produce a nuclear weapon, if it chose to do so, has narrowed to a matter of weeks by some assessments. Iran has not crossed the final threshold. It has deliberately and carefully stayed just short of it, but it has also made clear that the knowledge and the infrastructure exist. That is the message. The threshold is close, and the decision to cross it or not to cross it belongs to Tehran for Israel. This is an existential issue in the most literal sense. Israeli officials have stated, repeatedly and publicly, that they will not permit Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. That is not a negotiating position. It is a strategic commitment that successive Israeli governments have treated as a red line. The question is not whether Israel would act to prevent Iranian nuclearization. The question is under what circumstances, at what moment, and with what level of American coordination or tolerance. Those questions do not have settled answers right now, and that uncertainty is itself a source of instability. Meanwhile, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Kuwait, look at this landscape with a combination of alarm and strategic hedging. They share Israel's concern about Iranian power. They have in some cases moved significantly toward normalization of relations with Israel, a historic shift driven precisely by the shared perception of the Iranian threat. But they also have their own populations, their own political constraints, and their own calculations about how close to align themselves with a conflict that could, under certain scenarios, draw them in. Saudi Arabia in particular is navigating an extraordinarily delicate position. It has been in talks with Washington about a formal security agreement. It has been exploring what a path toward normalization with Israel might look like. But it has also been watching the images coming out of Gaza and calculating the domestic and regional costs of being seen as too closely aligned with Israeli military operations. These are not simple choices, and the uncertainty in Riyadh adds another layer of unpredictability to an already volatile environment. Here is something that gets lost in the coverage of individual battles and specific diplomatic agreements. Ceasefires, in multi-actor conflicts of this kind, do not function the way they function in conventional wars between two nation-states. In a conventional war, you have two armies, two governments, and two chains of command. You negotiate a ceasefire. Both sides agree. Both sides ordered their forces to stop. If both governments are capable of enforcing the order, the guns stop. The mechanism is relatively clean, even if the politics are not. The Middle East is not a conventional war. It is a multi-actor conflict environment in which the parties include nation-states and non-state armed groups, ideological movements and criminal networks, regional powers and global powers with competing interests, and local actors who pursue their own agendas within the broader conflict landscape in this environment. A ceasefire between two of the actors does not bind the others. It does not prevent a militia from firing a rocket. It does not stop a drone from being launched. It does not prevent a naval confrontation in a contested waterway. The ceasefire is partial. By definition, the conflict is total. This is where things become dangerous. In an environment with this many actors, this many weapons, and this many competing objectives, the risk of miscalculation is not theoretical. It is structural. It is built into the architecture of the situation. Consider the following scenario. A militia commander in Iraq, operating under loose coordination with Tehran but with considerable local autonomy, decides to conduct an operation that he believes serves the interests of the broader resistance. He launches a drone strike at an American base. The strike is smaller than previous ones. He believes it will be absorbed as part of the background noise of the conflict. He is wrong. The strike kills 2 American soldiers. Washington faces immediate domestic political pressure to respond forcefully. The response strikes militia positions in Iraq and Syria. Iran, watching its proxy network take direct American fire, feels compelled to signal resolve. It authorizes Hezbollah to conduct a limited operation against Israeli forces on the northern border. Israel responds with airstrikes on Lebanese infrastructure that was in place collapses within 72 hours. Nobody in that chain of events intended to start a war. Every actor made a decision that seemed, from their perspective, limited and manageable. But the cumulative effect of those decisions was escalation. And this is what makes the current situation so precarious. The risk is not primarily that someone will make a decision to go to war. The risk is that someone will make a smaller decision, and the system will do the rest. There is also the factor of strategic ambiguity, which sounds like a technical term but is, in fact, a description of something very human. When actors in a conflict are uncertain about each other's red lines, about what actions will trigger a response and what actions will not, they begin to probe, they test, they push slightly further than before to see what happens. Sometimes nothing happens, and the probing continues, and sometimes something does happen, and the system lurches toward a place that nobody fully intended to reach. The Middle East has multiple actors, all of them probing, all of them uncertain about each other's thresholds. That is not a stable equilibrium. It is a system under constant stress, waiting for the moment when the stress exceeds the structure's capacity to absorb it. Let us be specific about how that moment could arrive, because vague warnings about instability are easy to ignore, but concrete scenarios are harder to dismiss. The first scenario involves a drone. Iranian-backed forces in Iraq or Yemen launch an armed drone targeting either American military assets or Israeli infrastructure. The drone is more accurate than expected. The damage is more significant. The casualties, if there are any, are visible. The political space for a restrained response narrows immediately. The responding party, whether the United States or Israel, conducts airstrikes. Those airstrikes hit targets that are embedded in civilian or urban areas. As military infrastructure in this region almost universally is, civilian casualties result. The images spread. Arab public opinion, already inflamed, shifts further. Other actors feel pressure to respond, and the cycle accelerates. The second scenario involves a maritime incident in the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes every day. It is bounded on one side by Iran and on the other by the Arabian Peninsula. Iran has threatened, in moments of tension, to close the strait. It has harassed commercial shipping. It has conducted what it describes as inspection operations that look, from the outside, very much like seizures. A confrontation in that waterway between Iranian naval or paramilitary forces and an American warship, or a vessel under American protection, could escalate with extraordinary speed. The geography is tight. The communication channels are limited. The reaction time is measured in minutes. In environments like that, accidents happen, and accidents in the Strait of Hormuz are not local accidents. They are global ones. The third scenario is perhaps the most dangerous precisely because it is the most abstract. It involves Israel and Iran directly. If Israeli intelligence determines that Iran has reached a threshold in its nuclear program that triggers the Israeli red line, the political and military pressure on the Israeli government to act would become enormous. An Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities would not be a limited operation. It would be one of the most consequential military actions in the modern history of the region. Iran would be compelled to respond, not because the response is strategically optimal, but because the internal political cost of not responding would be unbearable. And the response would involve not just Iranian military assets, but the full mobilization of the proxy network, Hezbollah, the Iraqi militias, and the Houthis acting simultaneously across multiple fronts. Israel would then face a war on multiple fronts, a scenario it has long planned for but never fully tested. The United States would face a decision about whether and how to intervene. China and Russia would face the same decision from the other direction, and the entire regional order would be in play. None of these scenarios is inevitable, let that be clearly stated. None of them is even necessarily likely in the near term, but each of them is plausible. Each of them is physically and politically possible, and the conditions that would allow any of them to occur are not hypothetical. They are present in the region today. Given all of this, what are the realistic paths forward? Not the optimistic ones, necessarily, and not the ones that diplomats prefer to describe in public, but the realistic ones. The first is fragile stability. This is the scenario in which the ceasefire holds longer than expected. The various actors, exhausted by recent conflict and constrained by their own internal pressures, choose to maintain the pause. Iran calibrates its proxy network carefully, pulling back from operations that would clearly trigger a large-scale response. Israel conducts limited operations, quietly and with enough deniability to avoid forcing public confrontations. The United States maintains its military presence in the region as a deterrent, and the deterrence continues to function. Diplomatic processes, however halting, continue to move. Months pass, and the immediate crisis recedes. This is not peace. It is not even a path toward peace, but it is stability of a kind. It is a situation in which the catastrophic scenarios remain off the table long enough for other processes, economic, political, and demographic, to begin reshaping the landscape. The honest assessment of this scenario is that it is possible but fragile. It requires every major actor in the region to exercise restraint simultaneously and continuously. It requires the proxy networks to remain under sufficient control so that no single commander makes a unilateral decision that breaks the equilibrium. It requires the internal politics of Israel, Iran, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and the United States to all remain compatible with de-escalation at the same time. That is a long list of conditions, and history suggests that in environments this complex, one of them tends to fail. The second scenario is continued shadow conflict. This is, in many ways, the most likely path. The ceasefire holds in its formal dimensions, but the conflict continues in every other dimension. Intelligence operations intensify. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure continue. Assassinations of key figures in the Iranian nuclear program or in militia. Leadership structures continue. Iranian arms shipments to proxy groups continue, carefully timed and routed to avoid the specific actions that would trigger a military response. Houthi activity in the Red Sea ebbs and flows depending on the political and military pressure at any given moment. Israel conducts periodic airstrikes in Syria against what it describes as Iranian weapons caches or Hezbollah logistics. Each of these individual actions stays below the threshold of full-scale conflict, but the cumulative effect is a region that remains perpetually mobilized, perpetually on edge, and continuously consuming resources, attention, and lives in a conflict that never formally begins and never formally ends. This is a costly equilibrium. For the people living in the region, it means years or decades of uncertainty, economic distortion, and political systems organized around the logic of conflict rather than the logic of governance. It is not catastrophic in the way that full-scale war is catastrophic, but it is deeply harmful, and it forecloses the kind of normal political and economic development that these societies deserve. The third scenario is sudden escalation. This is the scenario that analysts most fear and that policymakers most work to avoid. It is the scenario in which one of the tripwires in the system is triggered, by accident, by miscalculation, or by a deliberate decision that its author believed was controllable. The cascading effect produces a conflict far larger than any of its individual triggers. This scenario does not require any single actor to decide to start a war. It requires only the system to fail at the moment when it is most stressed. And systems under the kind of stress that currently exists in the Middle East fail, with a regularity that history has documented in extraordinary detail. Now step back from the region and look at what all of this means for the rest of the world. Because the Middle East does not exist in isolation. What happens there has effects that reach into every major economy, and into the strategic calculations of every major power. The most immediate mechanism of global impact is energy. The Middle East sits atop a significant portion of the world's proven oil and gas reserves. The logistics infrastructure for moving that energy out of the region pipelines, ports, and maritime corridors, passes through geography that is directly exposed to conflict. The Strait of Hormuz, as already noted, handles approximately 20% of global oil supply. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea handles another significant share of global trade, including energy shipments. The Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping that occurred during the recent escalation cycle were not merely symbolic. They produced real economic consequences. Global shipping rates rose sharply. Vessels rerouted around Africa, adding weeks to transit times and significant costs. Insurance premiums for vessels transiting the region spiked. Inflationary pressure in economies already struggling with the aftermath of COVID-19 and the Ukraine war increased. All of that came from a relatively limited campaign by a single, non-state actor operating with Iranian-supplied technology. Now, imagine that being multiplied. Imagine a scenario in which the Strait of Hormuz is temporarily closed, or in which significant damage to oil infrastructure in the Gulf forces a prolonged reduction in supply. The economic consequences would be global, immediate, and severe. Oil prices would spike in ways that would transmit through the entire global economy. Every sector that depends on energy, which is to say every sector, would be affected. Economies that are already fragile would be pushed toward crisis. The political consequences in democracies struggling with cost of living pressures would be significant and unpredictable. And then there is the great power dimension. The Middle East has become, in recent years, a theater for competition between the United States, China, and Russia in ways that add another layer of complexity to an already complex situation. The United States has deep and long-standing commitments in the region: treaty relationships, military bases, intelligence partnerships, and the foundational commitment to Israel's security. Those commitments are not going away, but they are under pressure. There is a growing debate within American politics about the sustainability, cost, and strategic logic of that level of engagement. China has moved in the opposite direction. It has deepened its economic relationships across the region. It brokered with considerable visibility a normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023. That move signaled that Beijing intends to be a political actor in the region, not merely an economic one. China has large and growing energy dependencies on Middle Eastern oil. It has strategic interests in regional stability, but its definition of stability does not necessarily align with that of the United States. And the presence of a major power competitor in a region where the United States has historically held primary influence creates new risks and potential miscalculations. Russia, despite being weakened by its war in Ukraine, remains a significant military and political actor. It maintains its presence in Syria through military bases at Tartus and Khomeini. It has deepened its relationship with Iran, a partnership shaped by shared strategic interests and common experience with Western sanctions. Russia's interest in Middle Eastern stability is selective. It benefits from high energy prices and from Western strategic distraction. Beyond that, its approach is more opportunistic than structured. The result is that the Middle East ceasefire is not just a regional development. It is a point of interaction between multiple great powers, each with its own interests, red lines, and tolerance for risk. Managing a fragile ceasefire in such an environment requires a level of coordinated diplomacy that the current global system may struggle to provide. Here, then, is the most honest assessment. The ceasefire exists. It is real. For those whose lives have become quieter and safer, even temporarily, it matters. It should not be dismissed. But the ceasefire is not peace. It is a pause. The underlying conflict, the structural competition, the proxy network, the nuclear issue, the fragmentation of authority, and the presence of heavily armed non-state actors all remain unchanged. What the ceasefire has created is a window, a narrow window in which something might happen. Diplomatic processes might restart. Confidence-building measures might be explored. Civilian populations might receive enough relief to prevent further radicalization. But the window is closing. The forces that created the conflict remain. The actors are still armed. The populations are still under pressure. The structural weaknesses of the region have not been addressed. The Middle East is not on the edge of war because a single actor has decided to start one. It is on the edge of war because the system itself makes conflict the easiest path. Every ceasefire that does not change that system only delays the outcome. And so we return to the beginning. The guns are quiet. The diplomats are cautious. The data shows improvement. But beneath that surface, nothing fundamental has changed. The ceasefire is holding, and the region is not stable. Both are true, and the space between those truths is where the next conflict is being shaped. This is not peace. This is a pause under pressure. And in the Middle East, pressure eventually finds release. Strategic analysis helps us understand escalation, but understanding conflict does not mean wishing for it. History repeatedly shows that war, in any form, carries costs that extend far beyond military objectives. Economic disruption, political instability, and human suffering rarely remain confined to battlefields. Whatever the strategic calculations, the hope remains the same, that tensions are contained before they harden into open conflict, and that decisions made in the first hours prevent consequences that could last for decades, because in the end, no doctrine, no missile system, and no alliance structure can erase the long-term cost of war.